All right, let's see. I suppose we're ready now, Bill. And so, Bill Joslin, welcome back to the Gnostic Media Podcast. What is this, your sixth time? Is that correct?
I believe so, yes, with some round tables.
Yes, and so this is your second show with just you and I. So, again, welcome back to the show. And you were a very popular guest with your episode on meditation last summer.
Well, it's nice to hear.
And so we're going to be discussing nonviolent communication today and whether or not it's consistent with the Trivium Method.
Yes, some more nonsense today.
Some more nonsense today. Good.
Yeah. So I think the first thing to say is that I think most people will jump on the fact that anytime you're going to speak nicely to somebody, that we're trying to bash that. And I don't think that's the case at all. Just because we're saying NVC has some issues with it and it's not consistent with the Trivium isn't justification for being a dick unwarranted. So I just wanted to put that out there first and foremost.
Being a dick unwarranted.
Unwarranted, because I reserve the right to be a dick with cause. So
right, and you're a big guy, and you could probably kickbox somebody through a wall pretty easily.
Well, maybe 20 years ago. Don't know about today.
So let's see, where did you want to begin? Now, you've sent me a slideshow, and we're going to integrate this with the video like we did last time, and then we're also going to put the slideshow out for PDF for people to download.
Yeah, and I'm just going to loosely follow the PDF. I'm not necessarily going to read them, but people can read them on screen if they need to. What I'd like to do is go through the Trivium and go through NVC side by side and show how they're inconsistent. Because if you look at the Trivium method and the changes from the classical Trivium, what starts to spin out of it is sort of a set of values or a value statement. And that statement is in direct contradiction to a value statement that would spin out of NVC. And I think that's really at the root of this, that I think for the most part on the surface, people go, well, NVC is great. This is a great way to get across to people. And then they look at some elements within NVC and see that they may line up to the Trivium. After this, I want to show that that's not the case at all. It doesn't line up with the Trivium, and if anything, using NVC is working directly against the Trivium.
And I would agree with that. And in fact, we've seen a number of websites over the last couple of years begin to promote NVC or nonviolent communication as the rhetoric aspect of the Trivium when in fact it is not. So we want to make clear that this is not part of the Trivium, and we're going to be showing research that shows why that connects nonviolent communication up to some pretty interesting stuff. So I won't give away too much right now, but we'll get into that as we go.
Yeah, it's a massive rabbit hole that I think we could only just touch on, or else we'd have hours and hours of episode to go through here.
And we're going to be doing more than one episode in this nonviolent communication series?
Yeah, I think we're going to have to. I think possibly the first one would really be about the Trivium and NVC. And then when we get into the connections, it spiders out into a whole bunch of stuff. It goes into MK Ultra, goes into current events today, and everything else.
Right, and you and I, you had found, I had found the name, but I didn't realize where it went to. But you had found that the nonviolent communication goes right up into the Club of Rome, and it also stems, like you just said, right up into MK Ultra under Dr. Carl Rogers, who is MK Ultra subproject, was it 47 or was it 97? I'm forgetting. I'd have to look now. But some really interesting stuff there. So we'll cover maybe a little bit of that today, and then save the in-depth analysis for next time on the history of NVC and near-linguistic programming.
Yeah, and I think the history is critically important because there is a network of ideas that demonstrate how NVC is really a tactic. This isn't necessarily about communication. There's some underlying values. It even ties into Bateson and cybernetics and memetics and so on.
And
so we'll get to that later.
And I should just mention real quick that you were a part of the roundtable discussions that were Remedy Roundtable that go into how Gregory Bateson was using the double bind, and of course we've exposed his native revivalism, etc. So this is definitely related to the double bind that the CIA was selling, and of course Gregory Bateson helped to found the CIA.
Yeah. So I'm going to jump ahead to screen number 3 on the PDF.
All right.
Okay, the first two are just disclaimers.
All right.
So I'm going to start with the classical trivium, and there is going to be overlap between the classical trivium and the trivium method. At one point, I'll distinguish between the two of them. So I've got here, with the trivium, the grammar teaches the mechanics of language in the classical trivium. It's really about learning Latin and where the student comes to terms. So it's really about defining definitions, defining the objects, defining the information perceived by the 5 senses. And is closely tied into Aristotle with the law of identity. A tree is a tree, it's not a cat, and so on. Logic being a dialectic, it's the mechanics of thought and analysis. So this is really about finding internal consistency with our thinking or our understanding about those terms. And then rhetoric, for the most part, is the application of that language or the application of that understanding. Okay. Classical trivium didn't always approach rhetoric that way. They had aligned rhetoric beside logic, where your grammar could flow into your logic or your grammar could flow into your rhetoric. It wasn't necessarily a linear approach through all three. So in rhetoric in the classical trivium was geared around persuasion. It's about persuading the listener or the reader. Okay? So I'm going to go to slide 4. We've got grammar concerned with identity or definitions. It's the rules of language. We've got logic concerned with non-contradictory structure. And we have rhetoric, which is concerned with instruction and persuasion. Each of the above 3 are treated as separate disciplines, and although related, they are not approached as a sequential procedure. So for instance, McLuhan's arguments that societies focus on logic stagnate the societies, and societies that focus on grammar and rhetoric flourish, implies that each are silos which can be used independently or selectively emphasized. Okay.
Let me just add there, and of course, Marshall McLuhan, he was a PR and media expert, and he wrote a book called The Classical Trivium, and of course, he is one of those whom I have been exposing in my work, working with MK Ultra and Tim Leary and Aldous Huxley and the gang.
Mm-hmm. And again, so this would be the classical approach of how the trivium was used to manipulate people. That you can manipulate the trivium to manipulate people and their understanding. But the classical trivium is an analogy for philosophy, where your grammar is essentially metaphysics, your logic is epistemology or dialectic, and your rhetoric leads into conduct and ethics. And that's why I want to show that when you go through the trivium, you land at a stance in ethics or values that NVC doesn't line up with. Okay? So classical trivium, a few flaws. Concern with identities in a statement. A exists as itself only. Entities are identified through their differences compared to other entities and are characterized by their similarities. So this is Aristotle's categories and so on. So in the breakdown there from the broad to the narrow would be essence, universal, genus, species, subject.
Let me just ask you, which slide are you on?
I'm sorry, I'm on 6 right now.
Okay.
Okay. So if definitions are not agreed upon, if the grammar is inconsistent between the two people, how are you ever going to communicate?
Which is why you need to define your terms whenever you're trying to discuss something. It's like, okay, well, you think this word means something different than I do. Well, this is why we define it first. And this is what Clint Richardson has done so much to expose with legalese and all of this stuff, and always make sure you're understanding the words that legal code uses, not what you think it uses.
Yeah.
Use a Black's Law dictionary or whatever the case is. When you have a conversation with someone, you need to define the terms before you proceed.
Yeah, and on that point, whoever gets to define the terms can dictate everything that flows out of it. So you can have what appears to be a very logically sound and seemingly valid argument and buy into it without understanding that whoever controlled the definition led you down that path. So if you don't understand that grammar is about the definitions, and whoever gets to dictate what the definitions are can dictate the logical outcome of your thinking. So this is another way that the trivium can be manipulated. If the facts are misidentified, ignored, or included despite of irrelevance, I'm on 7 right now, one can mislead others and accept the premises which are not factual, relevant, or accurate. So I have an example here. For example, blue eyes are not blue. Or we hear that the sky isn't blue, or so on. Blue eyes have no pigmentation. They are actually clear. Light scatters throughout the iris, letting only blue light escape. Thus, they appear blue, but they're not. But they're actually clear. Now, this is a fallacious argument, and what it's doing is it's taking one category, the category of substances, and another category, the category of attributes, and arguing an attribute as a substance. So the above is arguing an attribute as though it's a substance. Blue is an attribute, something which occurs through a substance. The explanation for blueness of eyes is merely a description of what happens in the iris. It describes an attribute, but then claims that blue eyes are false by the standards of a substance. Blue eyes have no pigmentation or a substance that's responsible for the blueness. Now, this happens quite often. If you can control the terms, or if you can have people approach the terms in the wrong way, they can take you down paths that are absolutely ridiculous. Okay, so now we'll go on to logic on slide 8. Logic is concerned with non-contradiction in its internal structure. It's impossible for A to be A and not A at the same time and in the same respect. Okay, so this classic Aristotle again. Do the meanings of statements follow without contradiction? So I've got the classics here. All men are mortal. Socrates is a man. Socrates is mortal. And then a false version of that same syllogism would be all apples are fruit, all bananas are fruit, all bananas are apples. All right, so it's about maintaining a consistency in thought and a lack of contradiction within our thinking about these terms. Okay, so this is where we get into fallacies, and fallacies are all about
Going
logic.
to the next slide, correct?
Yeah, the next slide. So there's been arguments online about how logic, you can't rely on logic for truth. And it's because logic can't stand on its own.
Logic has to have the grammar.
That's right. So when you hear the arguments that you can't trust logic, or logic is flawed, or inductive logic is impossible and deductive logic is circular, all of this stuff is ignoring the fact that that logic spins out of grammar. It spins out of a recognition of what's happening in reality.
And let me just add something to that, because and we've emphasized this in the past many times, is that if people put why before who, what, where, and when, they're nearly always going to come to false conclusions, because that leaves logic standing on its own, and it puts logic before grammar. But if you ask the who, what, where, when, and why, and then apply the logic to that, then everything is in the right order. Who, what, where, when, then why, then how.
Yeah, and then so with the trivium, there are all of our what questions, the what, the who, the when, that's all pertaining to grammar, and the logic is all about the why. Because if you place the logic first, the logic dictates your definitions. If we look at the world, if we look at the world through a filter, one presumption that everything's broken down into either being a Satanist or not, and now we're going to look at the world through that lens, everything you have now rests on an assumption that that is the definition for everything you're seeing. So that's throwing a logic before your grammar, right? And this is these type of arguments rely on people's lack of questioning assumptions. There'll be an assumption behind the argument that's never talked about directly, and it's never addressed directly, but it is being communicated in every sentence, that assumption's there. And if you don't question those assumptions, you can go down ridiculous paths. Okay, so I'll go back to fallacies here. There's tons online about fallacies. Fallacy statements can have a proper logical structure and be incorrect due to false premises. The facts are incorrect, or there's no grammar. All right? Or the statements do not follow a proper logical structure. So we're talking about sound arguments versus valid arguments. Logic cannot stand on its own. This leads to rationalism. So the idea of a priori arguments, that they're true by their definition, and then we can create a logic based off of that a priori definition, leads you into like absolutism around ethics and all of this other nonsense. This is how the classical trivium held up the church power for hundreds of years, because they had a priori definitions of which their logic spun out of.
And you can see how the intelligence community bases things off of the work of Aldous and Julian Huxley, that they're doing the exact same thing there. Julian or Aldous Huxley wrote this book, Enemies of Freedom, that goes through and justifies his whole plan against society and everything. It's all tongue in cheek when you read it, but it's and he admits in his letters that, his grandfather taught them to be hardcore logicians, but failing proper grammar before they reach conclusions. So then we see all of this ridiculous Brave New World nonsense as a blueprint for society.
Well, even doesn't Huxley have this in the Doors of Perception, a quote about something about lifting the filters of perception, and the base assumption is that your physical senses are filters of perception.
Right, rather than your way of gaining perception, it's the filter. So he's flipping it backward.
That's right. Instead of taking how we process information from our senses as the filter and the sensory data as perception, you flip the two and say, well, the sensory information is the filter. Let's strip that away with psychedelics or meditation, and all you're left with is the processing of no data.
And
all you're left with is the filters.
And we do know now that Huxley did have a severe case of dissociative disorder. He actually thought that his body was another person, that it was a different object separate from himself. Okay. I mean, the guy was completely
Well, at least you can
batty.
Keep yourself company. Okay, so like I said, logic can't stand it on its own. It has to be sound with true premises that come out of your grammar, right? And again, I said the trivium has been used successfully as a means to argue the arbitrary, things that are not based in reality, and give validity to false ideas. So logic is good. It's a very good thing. It's a necessary thing, but it can't stand without data, without reality. Okay, so we're going to go to slide 10 and 11. I'll talk about both at the same time. I have two quotes here, and it's going to be one of the few times that I agree with Plato and not Aristotle. And they're quotes about rhetoric. And just on a side note, Plato was one of these people that rarefied an idea, the idea of the perfect forms, and then reality spun out of that. So this, again, was putting logic before grammar, where Aristotle reversed that. But Plato has a good quote here about rhetoric. Plato famously, and you can find this on Wikipedia, the link is there. Plato famously outlined the differences between true and false rhetoric in a number of dialogues. Plato disputes the sophistic notion that the art of persuasion can exist independently of the art of dialectic. So he's saying that rhetoric and logic have to be attached. He suggests the possibility of a true art wherein rhetoric is based upon the knowledge produced by dialectic, so that rhetoric spins out of logic, and relies on dialectically informed rhetoric. Where Aristotle said something else. For Plato and Aristotle, dialectic involves persuasion. So when Aristotle says that rhetoric is the antistrophe of dialectic, he means that it is parallel to but different from dialectic. So he's putting logic and rhetoric side by side, where grammar goes into one or the other. as opposed to Plato that says it all spins one from the next. When Aristotle characterizes rhetoric as the tristrophy of dialectic, he no doubt means that rhetoric is used in place of dialectics. The domain of rhetoric is civic affairs. So you got to remember, these guys were training politicians. That was their main role. Their schooling was to train people that would be politicians. Not theoretical considerations of observational definitions of terms and clarification of thought. These, for him, are the domain of dialectic. So one, for him, logic leads into instruction, and rhetoric leads into persuasion. So these weren't about truth. It was about tools. You use one tool to instruct and one tool to persuade. So I'm going to come back to this idea of, well, we can just grab these things and use them like ratchets. We ratchet here and a screwdriver there. This is not the case, because we're talking about the use of our mind here, not just picking up tactics. Okay, so I'm going to go on to 12 here. Rhetoric or desired outcomes can influence logic and data selection. So predefined logic can filter or bias data sets. Logic affects grammar, if you put it beforehand. We can present facts in a false context to create a rhetoric which appears to be sound and factual. We can downplay data or justify eliminating data and focus on rationale or logic to create the impression of truth, which is valid but has no factual basis. So a priori arguments. Each area, if emphasized or predetermined, can influence the others, making it inconsistent with reality, yet still appear to be true. Okay, so just an overview of these flaws. This is 13. Because the classical trivium sees each as separate but related tools which can be drawn upon independently or disproportionately to fit one's purpose, it can be used to create the appearance of truth and cause uncertainty or confusion about reality. Essentially, it can fail. So from people that are looking at the trivium today, the trivium method, in this case, the classical trivium can fail, unless you're trying to manipulate somebody. The question then is, fail to do what?
Yeah, and
So
we
now
should
I'm
we
gonna
should
go on to
point
the
out
trivium
that
method.
right, and we should point out that the classical trivium is not the trivium method. It's sort of the inverse of the trivium method is sort of the inverse of the classical trivium.
Yeah, and there was very particular changes from the classical trivium to the trivium method for very good reason.
And what we see, in fact, out there today on many of these shows supposedly promoting the trivium is that they are, in fact, promoting the classical trivium and then promoting the failures within it and misleading people with that.
Yeah, they present the trivium method and then they use the classical trivium.
Exactly.
Or then they present the trivium method and then criticize it on the foundations of the classical trivium. Right. So again, the grammar's off. The definitions are confused, conflated. Okay, so now I'm going to go into the trivium method. Okay, so grammar is the identification of entities which exist in reality. Logic is how one understands the relationships between these entities. Therefore, a complete and accurate set of identities must be known, or known to the best of your ability. Rhetoric is the application of understanding and knowledge. Therefore, both knowledge and understanding need to be complete and consistent, or the application will likely fail. So we're really talking about a consistency from reality to thinking to action, which is why in philosophy, the realm of rhetoric is about ethics and conduct.
I suppose right there we should say rhetoric is the application of knowledge and understanding, not understanding and knowledge.
Yeah. True, yes. Okay, so I'll go on to the next slide here. Rhetoric is dependent on logic and grammar. Logic is dependent on grammar. So we're talking about a hierarchy of ideas here, that there is derivatives. Grammar is dependent on reality. So we have an underlying assumption here. So we're making an assumption and we're not talking about directly. So we should talk about that directly. And the underlying assumption is that existence exists. That if you're using the trivium method, you're coming from a place that you believe reality is real. That it's not derivatives from a spiritual realm, or it's not the product of social constructivism. You believe the coffee cup in front of you is a real coffee cup.
So what you're saying, if somebody throws a rock at your head, you're going to believe the rock is going to hit you and you're going to duck out of its way, hopefully, or it'll conk you.
That's right. Okay, so the axiom behind anything that you're doing with the Trivium Method is existence exists, the law of identity. Okay, so by ordering the trivium into a method, knowledge and understanding becomes rooted in reality, in this axiom that existence exists, which leads to skillful means and provides a foundation for further learning. So one of the things that people attack with critical thinking is that you can never be certain about anything. And it's ignoring the fact that knowledge is open-ended. We can have certainty and knowledge to a certain point, and that can be updated with new information later. But it's only going to be updated if we stick to this method.
And not only that, but this method allows for, the Trivium Method, as opposed to the classical Trivium, allows for new information to come in, because it's sort of like a corkscrew, who, what, where, when, who, what, where, when, and you're always digging down and looking at the information. So if new information comes in, you've already processed all of the other information, then you can simply go back and review it, see if it fits, see if it's a contradiction. If it's a contradiction, you're able to dig down a further level and verify it or not. Toss it if you need it, or include it if it's a valid point. But this is the only way that we essentially have to review things and to go back and either, insert new information or dismiss it. But there are certain instances, let's say you're doing historical research. What did this person say? You can go in and verify that primary citation, and you can know at that specific time and date what that person said. And it's, not going to, suddenly change. Somebody might find more information that updates different aspects of it, but on that date and time, et cetera, that person said those specific comments.
Yeah, so you have to drive back to the concretes. You have to drive all the way back to the primary documentation. And then from there you can build on it, and you can eventually get to a level of concepts that you're not just explaining, the documentation that's there or describing the evidence. You can actually start to draw conclusions. But the conclusions are an integration of these concretes. So when new information comes in, you have a certain amount of certainty about how you've integrated information. New information comes in, you're integrating the new information. So if you don't follow the same method with that, using the method allows this new information to maintain that consistency. And you can ask, is this true? Is this relevant? Is this applicable? Is this false? And really what you're doing is you're integrating the information into greater conceptual understanding. So you can draw conclusions about primary documentations. If a person has said something enough times, they might not come right out and say, we're trying to screw over the middle class, but you can eventually draw that conclusion because you have it based on a foundation of concretes, right? As long as you can drive it back down to the concretes, you have a valid point to make. So people will stand up with this empiricist argument, but he never said that. Well, it doesn't matter. If the person has a chain of ideas and that's expressed enough times, you can be reasonably certain that that's what they're doing or that's what they're believing. Right.
And this is exactly how this process is exactly how we've flushed out MK Ultra and the rest of this material, and how it folds right back into nonviolent communication and neuro-linguistic programming.
That's right. So the argument that I just made, well, you don't have direct evidence that the person said that, is empiricism, and this is another way that the Trivium Method can be subverted. If you get people to focus only on the evidence that's available, so you're only going to focus on the grammar and say, well, you can't draw those conclusions, you're negating logic. You're negating conceptualization. So essentially what that argument is to say, don't integrate the information. If you don't have direct evidence for it, then you can't integrate any kind of conclusion. You can't draw any conclusions. All you can do is describe the evidence in reality. So there is so much of this that goes on in our society right now, is that there's or up until about the 60s or 70s, that if there wasn't a direct observable effect, then it doesn't exist. So Hayek will say society doesn't exist. Or people will say reality doesn't exist. Show me reality. You can't point at it. You can't show it to me. This is logical positivism that says anything outside of evidence, anything beyond the grammar is invalid. But that's not the case. You can draw conclusions and you can integrate into higher order ideas, but only if they are consistent with reality. So I'll move on. I'll leave that diatribe for another time.
I'm just going to I'm going to add real quick before you go to the next slide that one important thing that Gino Denning made clear to me years ago was that there are no contradictions in nature. And this has been something that's key to understand. You don't see rockbird or something like that. It's there is a consistency within nature, and whenever you see someone using a contradiction in nature, they're likely trying to fool you or pull your leg.
Yeah. And any contradictions that we come across, for instance, like visual illusions. So say you put a pen in a glass of water and the pen looks bent. It's a visual illusion. We're looking at it and we say, well, my eyes are telling me that the pen is bent. Well, it's not telling me that the pen is bent. I might make that assumption. I may have a conclusion based out of my logic that's in the absence of other information, like the refraction of light through water. But once I understand the refraction of light through water, it doesn't change what I'm seeing. When I'm looking, the pen is still bent. So our senses are certain. So these arguments about skepticism goes back to arguing the identification or recognition of what we're seeing in our senses as a flaw of the senses. And that's, again, it's a conflated idea. You're putting the recognition or the understanding or how you identify what you're seeing and making it or arguing it as though that's what you're seeing. Because with the new information and the new understanding, that visual illusion doesn't change in your eye. You're still seeing it that way. Your sensory data is still correct. But now how you're identifying it is different. So you've got to be careful with people's thoughts and what they're selling us. I'm going to go on to slide 16, which gets into the idea of conceptualization. It's a complicated slide here. Ordering is important for this reason. Okay, so I'm going to start at the very bottom of the page where it says axioms. Existence exists. It's more than self-evident. Anything is impossible without this axiom. So axioms, people will argue that you can't prove that reality exists. It's because axioms are beyond proof. You can't make the statement that reality doesn't exist without there being a reality that exists for you to say it in. So again, another one of these ways of twisting things on their head is to take an axiom and argue it as though it's a precept or a percept. So we always start off with that one axiom, the law of identity. Existence exists, A is A. It doesn't need proof. Our ability to think or view the world or analyze anything is impossible without that one axiom. From there, we move up a level to percepts, as in perception, what we're perceiving are concretes. They're observable, they're quantifiable, you can prove them deductively. Sometimes they're self-evident, sometimes you need to think about them a little bit. Okay, so they're not always self-evident, but this is the realm of sensory data or instrumentational data or so on. This is our interface with reality. And from the information, from those concretes, from those observations, we move up to a concept. So I'm moving inductively here. We draw a conclusion or we form an understanding from these observations. So this is why logic is important. Logic takes us from what we're observing, the grammar. We go through all the whats. We're identifying things observably. Now we move through logic to be able to draw a conclusion. Now we're taking that knowledge of the world and we're turning it into an understanding. Now we can take those concepts, that concept with more percepts, more concretes, or other concepts that we're certain about, and we can form higher order concepts. So they're induced from other concepts and percepts. Okay, the foundation is logic built upon concepts rooted in reality. Then we can do that again, higher order, even more sophisticated concepts induced from other concepts and percepts, but the foundation of the logic is still built upon concretes rooted in reality. They always have a thread that can eventually be traced back to existence, to reality. Okay? So higher order concepts are built on lower order concepts, which are built upon concretes in reality. And regardless of the intangibility of a higher order concept, by analyzing its foundations, we eventually hit concretes in reality. And if a concrete's not rooted in reality, it's arbitrary. If it's an a priori definition, then it's arbitrary.
And what do you do with an arbitrary?
yelled.
No problem. What do you do with an arbitrary argument?
You disregard it offhand. It's not
Right.
even wrong. It doesn't
Right.
even qualify to be
Right.
judged as if it's right or wrong.
So if I come to you and I claim that there's a green fairy sitting here on my shoulder and I provide you no evidence, what do you do with that?
I look at you like you're nuts. There's nothing to argue.
But
There's no
Bill,
talking to you.
Bill, you're not being spiritual enough, or
Yeah, I'm not being democratic.
right.
with my
And
ideas.
these are actually how this type of argument is used. So and the onus of proof. Let me just add here, the onus of proof is very important here because whoever makes a claim, it's on them to support their own arguments. If I claim that there is a green fairy sitting here on my shoulder, it's on me to prove that it's there, and I'm going to probably insert a little green fairy image right here during the... But if I don't prove that green fairy is sitting there, then it is arguing the arbitrary and it's dismissed by default. You cannot prove you cannot prove a negative. It's not on you to prove that it's not there. It's on me to prove that it is there, period.
Mm-hmm. And without contradiction. And with something that's observable that I can check for myself. Which is why you don't do things like rely on Carol Quigley's Tragedy and Hope, because it's not a primary document and there's no citations. So you can't go down that road. No matter how much you like the ideas, it's not a primary document. The other person can't verify it for themselves. So if the onus of proof is on you, your proof has to be not only non-contradictory, it has to tie back somewhere in reality that I can go check for myself and be able to identify that for myself. Okay, so I'll go on to slide 17. And you can see that we have concretes at the bottom and we go up through to concepts. Your concretes, your observations become your grammar, the identification of things in reality. Then we move through a phase of logic, and the new understanding becomes the rhetoric.
And you have those marked as G, L, and R, just so people know.
That's right. Yeah. And then from that, those concepts can now be a new set of grammar that we can move through, a new set of logic into a higher order level of understanding, which would be the rhetoric. So this is the same as what you're saying about the Trivium Method being a screw. We work it in and out. That it's an iterative process. So the outcome of one cycle, rhetoric as a new concept that's understood, becomes the grammar of the next cycle. Then the next concept is of higher order, but can still be traced back to reality. So deductively, we can move back down through those concepts until we reach the percepts, the primaries again. Okay? Concepts are not arbitrary ideas. They are not created. They represent sophisticated observations and relationships in reality. So just because something's a higher order concept doesn't mean it's invalid because it doesn't have immediate evidence for it. Okay, so that's an important point.
Yeah, a lot of times when you've done a lot of research on things, you've gone through this stage of grammar, logic, rhetoric, and corkscrewing, or as you've laid it out here, you've gone through this many, many different times, and so your level of understanding may be far above where other people's are for that immediate grammar observation. And as you point out in this slide, this base level grammar uses deductive logic, and then once you've built up a large enough pool of information, you can begin to use inductive logic to come to deeper understanding with that information.
That's right. And there's a lot of people that they'll slag different forms of logic. They'll slag abductive logic, or they'll slag an analogous logic. There's points where these things are helpful. Abductive logic doesn't bring you to certainty, but abductive logic is essentially sort of guessing.
You mean inductive?
No, abductive.
Abductive. Okay.
Yeah, so it's kind of like guessing, but where abductive logic is applicable is when you're forming a hypothesis. When you have all of this observation in front of you and you're like, what does this mean? You can make educated guesses, and then you have to vet them for certainty and vet them for truth. So abductive logic has its place.
And how you know that abductive logic and inductive logic is accurate, for that matter, is when you go out in reality to verify it. The information that you're seeking should be where you think it ought to be.
Yeah. So you, with abductive logic or analogous logic, which is comparison to similar systems, these are about creating hypothesis. Induction, deduction, more observation, measurement. This is about creating certainty and creating the next concept, creating the reality of it. So it's not like you can throw out abductive or throw out analogous because it doesn't lead to knowledge, because what it is it's about opening a door. You can have a concept developed and go, but there's still something off with it. And then you can look at a similar system that has similar properties, and that can give you insight into where you can look next in what you're doing. But it doesn't mean because the two are comparable that they're the same. All it does is give you a new place to look. So you got to be careful when people throw out ideas. You can't trust inductive logic. It never leads to certainty. It never leads to truth, only possibility. Or you can't rely on deductive logic because it always has an induction behind it. This is nonsense. This is taking concepts, flipping them around, addressing them in terms of relationships that are not there. So you got to think it through. So I'm going to go on to slide 18 here. Slide 18 shows how we can take this process and throw it on its head. I can take a concept that's not necessarily built in reality. I can just make a definition. Or I can take a concept that is valid, and I can address that as though it's axiomatic. I can treat that as though it's so self-evident and so absolute that I don't even need proof for it. Okay, so we saw this recently with the veganism thing. They had taken Kantian ethics and took an a priori statement and said this is a moral axiom, and it's not a moral axiom.
Right.
And it's not a moral axiom because there were concepts within that statement that are not axiomatic. So if you say something like "do no harm" is a moral axiom, you have to say, well, what is doing? What is harm?
Right, and that plays on to a point that I've raised with this, and essentially what they're doing is using the natural law to then apply this axiom across the board and then say you cannot do harm. But if the brain, for instance, is made of 77% cholesterol or hydroxycholesterol, and every cell in the body is made up of saturated fats, and you're trying to raise children by following this axiom, then you're going, period, to be doing harm to those children. So therefore, it invalidates that whole argument in and of itself.
Yeah, and that as a moral axiom, take for instance a doctor that's going to do surgery. They're going to cut into the body. They're going to cause bruising. They're going to put stitching in. There's going to be blood loss. They're doing harm. But the outcome should be better health for that person. So this is, whether I agree with do no harm or not, which I do, I don't agree that it's an axiom. And any argument you make by resting your arguments on a false axiom are going to be inevitably flawed. So just like Kant with his categorical imperatives and everything else, it takes you down paths that take you to higher order concepts. You know, we talked about, you were saying that you could be talking at a level here and other people that are new to an area are down here. Well, it can take you to a level of such degree of nonsense, it's justifying the most ludicrous behavior and thinking in your own mind. And it's because of this one flaw at the bottom.
And they'll think that they're using the trivium throughout if they're caught in this mess.
That's right, because Well, I started with my axioms. I went through my whats. I did my why, and this is my how. And they never questioned how these things were being organized.
And
So,
so, for instance, in the analogy or the example of diet, you need to have a foundation and understanding of human biology, for instance, or biology in general. Okay, so are cells made up of fats? Is the brain made up of cholesterol? Well, then that would obviously raise the question: why would people be selling a low-fat, low-cholesterol, low-sodium diet that's in direct contradiction with biology?
that's right.
And then you have to look at other factors playing into that. And okay, what is the agenda behind this person using the Trivium to sell this vegan agenda or this agenda, that agenda, etc.?
Yeah. And those agendas it can be an agenda of one person. I want to write more articles, or I want to have another seminar. Or it can be buying into a larger agenda that they're not even aware of. So this is
Sure.
why we have to think things through. It's the only mind you have. You have to take care of it. So specifically, this is what I've outlined here is the idea of the fallacy of the stolen concept, where you take a higher order concept, you bring it down. A higher order concept has dependencies that it rests upon. You bring it down, ignoring those dependencies, and then building a logic up above it. So again, this is one way that the trivium can be misused. Okay, that's why we got to start at the what's. Okay, so I'll just read it out here. We can have higher order concepts and treat them as though they are percepts or axioms, and build a case which has evidence and valid logic, but yet be totally devoid of reality. So you could analyze this whole thing and go, it's got to be true, because there's evidence for it, the logic is sound, it makes perfect sense to me, but there's one assumption there that you're missing, and that's that the core assumptions or the core axioms behind it are not based in reality. So concept is an idea rooted in reality. You got to start with what?
As the old saying, the map is not the territory.
So ideas can be applicable to observation and provide predictability, yet be completely disconnected from reality. And I'll give you an example of this. All of the explanations I had around meditation, around qi in the body and jing and prana and all of this other stuff, they afford a lot of predictability. When you have an understanding of how this stuff works and the logic that they use behind it, you can diagnose issues with your meditation, you can adjust for them, you can make explanations about what's happening, and it has predictability. And then when we have that predictability and we have the experience to go along with it, it must then be true. But what we're dealing with a framework that has no percept in reality. It's based on one assumption, and that there's this spiritual energy of which everything is made up of. Right? So what we end up with are pseudo explanations, and they can give us predictability.
Quantum physics.
And we can go places with them, and they can help us, and they can take us into better understanding and so on. But they're still highly flawed. They're pseudo explanations. They're not real explanations. If there's something in there that you can't identify directly, you're dealing with a pseudo explanation. Okay, so I'm going to move on to 19.
And how I usually explain that, Bill, is if we're just to add another layer of understanding, if let's say the table right here, maybe the table behind me, we put all of the stuff that we're observing on the table, and then we'll call the table the commons. And Bill, you walk in and I make a claim, and you walk over to the table or the commons and you pick the thing up and you can say, yep, that's true. I can use my common sense to verify that this thing is true. Mm-hmm. But what the trick is with mind control is that everything off of the table, around the table, outside of the table, that is used for the place of this control or this manipulation or falsification of these false axioms that are used to cloud the trivium or to cloud other topics. They're not placed on the table or in the commons where anyone can simply go verify it. So people need to keep this in mind going back to what you said, can you go back in there and verify things simply in reality and not appealing to mysticism or magic or spirituality or something that cannot be verified? And what we're learning more and more through all of this is that mysticism is the tool of tyrants, and I think it was Peikoff who said that at the end of one of his whole lecture series, maybe The Philosophic Corruption of Physics or Intro to Logic, but he made that point clear, and the first time I heard it, I thought it was absolutely outrageous.
Yeah.
And then the more I thought about it over several years, right then and there, instead of thinking with fallacies and, Peikoff's a Randian idiot and screw that guy, I started thinking and saying, okay, well, I'm going to find an example where mysticism is not the tool of tyrants. And it's been about 4 years, and I haven't found an example yet.
Yeah. Well, this goes back to the idea. So we were talking about as you go through the trivium, what you're doing is integrating information. And then when you get to new information, you integrate that into the existing knowledge that you have. Well, there's a number of ways you can do that wrong. You can misintegrate it. So you can draw connections and relationships that are false or find relevance that's not there. So you end up bringing information in that has nothing to do with the topic at hand and then analyzing it by that. So my relationships with my family are based on authoritarian rules. So they're all creeps and I'm never going to talk to them again. So you can misintegrate information or you can disintegrate it. So when we were talking about only sticking with evidence and only sticking with empiricism, this is a disintegration. It's a disdain for higher order understanding, for the concepts and knowledge and understanding that we create. Meditation is about disintegrating information. Disassociating is disintegrating the information that you've acquired over your life until all you have is the meditative state. Then you throw on that a framework of mysticism, which is about misintegrating the information. So now you're going to rebuild yourself from a torn down place, built on a framework with basic assumptions that are absolutely false. Right? So
and cannot be verified for that
can
matter.
Never be verified. You have to adopt, but then you can go, but wait a minute, this thing predicted this experience and it explains that experience, so I've proven it to myself.
And then you just go from there in a self-gratifying system of justification.
Yeah, and it must be true as opposed to, is it really true? Is this really true? And at the very fundamental of spirituality is that initial axiom, existence exists.
Let me just add here real quick. One thing that I found that's really helpful, Bill, is whenever I approach any new topic, I approach it as though I am completely 100% incompetent and then start from there. And then you have to go in, well, who, what, where, when, then why, and then you can come to how and explain how. But if you come in with a bias or with a bunch of assumptions and that you know everything based on some spiritual hoop-de-doo that you heard from Amit Goswami or
appeal to authority.
Appeal to authority, some quantum physics, some appeal to magic, etc., then except for the occasional luck, every subsequent conclusion that you reach is going to be false.
Yeah. Yes. And if it's misintegrated information, some areas will integrate, some areas won't. And you can't focus on the some areas that integrate and then claim it all to be perfectly constructed. That's cherry picking. So all of the fallacies, it's 2,000 years of sort of hieristic rule by thumb because people have encountered this stuff before. So you can't ignore it. The stuff gets misaligned, right? And we're being herded into this thinking by so many people.
Yeah, and it's clear that at least since the time of Plato and Aristotle, if not way before, all the way back to the Mahabharata and probably thousands of years before that this stuff has been going on.
Yeah, well, mysticism ruled the world until Aristotle. And I'm sure prior to where mysticism rose, people were living in reality because they needed to eat and light fires and things.
And we see that the key behind MK Ultra is to sell mysticism back into society. Well, and they'll claim that mysticism has been ripped from society. even though they're trying to destroy Christianity and the Protestant ethic at the same time. It's like, well, if it was ripped from humanity, then why do they still believe in Christianity in general?
That's right.
And you know, and then why target Christianity and why target their work ethic if that was really the case of what you were going after?
Yeah, and at the core, whatever the complaints are about Christianity is the same complaints about mysticism. And where did that work ethic, that Protestant work ethic, rise? It rose out of a time when people started questioning the authority. It's when authority lost its grip, and when authority loses its grip, people become brilliant. We have the Renaissance, we have the Enlightenment when the boots are off our neck, so we see. On one hand, Christianity is bad, destroy the work ethic, it's patriarchy or whatever else, but then we're being force-fed the exact same structure of information,
Right.
And when you look at, say, mysticism with these rarefied ideas, these stolen concepts, and then you look at something like science, and the idea that space and time, there's an underlying assumption behind physics right now. Space and time never gets questioned as to its existence. Existence is something that has happened within space through time. But if existence exists, space and time didn't exist before existence. That's an impossibility. Space and time and matter all must have come up at the same time. So it's not like the universe exists in this box, or it's hurtling through this thread of time. The three are immutable. You can't get rid of the three. But if you're starting from the assumption and never question it that the universe happens in space and is occurring at the beginning of time, which you can't have a beginning of time, you start drawing false conclusions like a Big Bang, and you can't get
or
past
intentionally selling false conclusions.
Yeah, and when you have the ability to think clearly, it doesn't seem counterintuitive or illogical or contradictory to accept that it's just always been here. It's like you can start to understand these ideas so that when you're hearing a physicist, Lawrence Krauss or whatever, talking about this stuff, you can go through these people with incredible education and find the flaws in their thinking. Doesn't mean that you're right if you get it, but it does mean that you're starting to take responsibility for your own knowledge. And that's at the end of the day what this is about. You can stop reading books to absorb other people's ideas, and you can start reading them to form your own. Like the Trivium Method is really, without the Trivium Method, we live our lives off rented and borrowed knowledge. We borrow knowledge from other people, we rent it from other people, we claim it as our own because we agree with it or it makes sense to us. The Trivium Method ends borrowed and rented knowledge. You start forming your own understanding that stands on your own legs.
And you read my new article, Spies in Academic Clothing, and you can see that this is the exact process that I went through with this article. Here were 7 books where they told us what to think about MK Ultra, the psychedelic revolution, etc. And instead of taking what they told us it was, I simply built the knowledge using the proper grammar and removing the fallacies, etc., and was able to put together a whole new understanding from their own information.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and because it's there.
It's there, right?
It's there in the information. It's there in the grammar, and then there's other things that you can do with that. You can see where it's either they've made a mistake, or where you can see that this is an intentional tactic.
Exactly.
And if you see the same tactic coming up and up, there's either going to be other indication that this person's epistemology is just flawed for some reason. And you can find that assumption that they're making and say, well, they made an error. Or you can find that there is an intention behind it.
And they're intentionally misleading the population with that. And when we
That's
find
right.
it in the 7 main books on MK Ultra and the psychedelic revolution since 1979 or since 1968 with Fuller's book, then we begin to see that this is an intentional cover-up and that these are academic cells performing this function against society.
That's right.
All right.
And then see everything. Yeah, okay, we'll go on to the next one. Okay.
That was a good segue, though, because I think it'll give people a lot more understanding and foothold for moving on here.
Yeah, and really, this isn't about tearing stuff down as much as giving people some meat on the bone to get a better understanding of the trivium. So I've got here the Trivium Method. The Trivium Method has, broadly speaking, done two things. It has approached each area, grammar, logic, rhetoric, as equal, essential, and inseparable, but also ordered each into sequential processes of learning. So it's understanding logic is derivative from grammar, rhetoric is derivative from grammar and logic. First one identifies all relevant entities in a subject area, and it is to ask, what am I really looking at? Then one identifies causal relationships, assesses relevance and importance, and it is to ask, why is it the way it is? Why is it like this? Then it is to ask, how can this be put to use? What does this mean to me? How can this be expressed? As a sequence which begins with reality, the Trivium Method vets and self-corrects at every step to preserve consistency with reality. This is what it's about. The Trivium Method is a self-correcting system.
Very well said.
Is not.
Right.
Okay?
Very well said.
And it's built right into the mechanism. If you've come to an error through using the Trivium Method, you will find that your error was in the application of the method. So that the point is that the Trivium Method is a self-correcting system. At each step, it corrects itself. If you're applying the Trivium Method and coming up to falsehoods, like this idea that you can use the trivium in a negative way, the Trivium Method in a negative way, I would wager to say no. Or I take the stance, no. If you're applying the method, it's not going to be used for deception. It can't be used for deception because it's about consistency with reality. So this idea that you can take the trivium and you can misapply it there, or you can take this and beat people over a stick with it, is bollocks. The only way that you can abuse the Trivium Method is by not using the Trivium Method.
Oh yeah, and I've been accused many times of beating people over the head with the trivium, when in fact, if they were willing to look at the facts and the information and lay their inconsistencies, their fallacies, and their contradictions aside, they would see that I'm just pointing out the facts and trying to get them to look at them. And of course, they have to spin it back into some form of ad hominem attack on me for their own failure at proper critical thinking.
Yeah, well, it's also a lot of the people in the audience, I think, don't realize that part of your job is to beat back trolls and make sure that people don't corrupt your work.
Exactly, and we see this attempted corruption going on all around, which is why we're having to do this show.
And that's what I think that people are overlooking when they're looking at the situation. The grammar of the situation isn't just I've said something and Jan's being a dick. Right? It's not that. It's that I've said something and Jan is doing his job. So what I'm getting at is that you're a professional, that you have a responsibility to defend and uphold the work that you do. And that comes at the beginning by doing rock solid research and making sure you don't get it wrong. But it also means at the end to make sure people aren't misrepresenting it and conflating it or sinking it in a sea of distraction. So when somebody's on Facebook with you coming up with nonsense and you attack them and they go, oh, well, you're such an asshole, and everybody looks around and yawns a dick, they're ignoring something that's legitimate in reality, which is your job is to defend your work. I don't have that responsibility. I'm just a guy that has something to say. I'm not trying to sell a book. I don't have a professional responsibility. So if you want to disagree with me, fine. I don't care. If you misunderstand me, I'll speak up and say, we got to clarify terms. I don't want to be misunderstood. But I'm not here to change your mind. So this constantly bashing you of beating people up with logic sticks or being an asshole and hurting your viewership, I think, is based on lazy thinking.
I totally agree with you. And it's funny is give a shout out to Joan there, but she's a psychologist and she's studied me and my work for years, and she is quite amused by these attacks on me. And she says, you know what? Just stick to it. Keep it up.
Yeah. And I mean, you have your right to how you deal with it, right? Okay, so now I'm going to go to slide 20. So this is really what I was saying about coming to a value statement about the Trivium Method. This is it here. If the Trivium Method is built upon some tacit assumptions. One, reality exists, reality can be known, and we can fail in our pursuit to understand it. If this isn't so, then why would we use the Trivium at all? If you're interested in the Trivium, you're operating off of these three assumptions. You can get it wrong, there's something to know, and that knowledge is somewhere in the world. Okay, so these are our axioms. Well, I shouldn't say axiom, but these are the base assumptions behind using the Trivium Method. Okay, so reality exists, it can be known, and I can screw it up, all right? Therefore, we can infer from the above a statement of values for the Trivium Method, and this is it. It is the pursuit of knowledge, understanding, and conduct which is consistent with reality. Okay, so I'm going to repeat that. It's the pursuit of knowledge, understanding, and conduct which is consistent with reality. If this isn't the case, then to what end has the classical Trivium been changed into the Trivium Method? Why would we change it if this was not true, if this was not why we're doing it? It can be for no other reason than to align our thoughts and actions with reality. Okay? So let's keep that in mind when we go into NVC, because this is what it's going to contradict with. Would you agree with that statement?
Absolutely, I would.
Okay.
In fact, that's very well said. I really like that, which is consistent with the reality or with reality.
I think I'm going to tattoo it.
There you go. All right, so let's go to this is slide 21 now.
Yeah, so slide 21. Now we're going to derive the foundation for what rhetoric should be based off that statement. So now we have a standard and measure to use in deciding if NVC is appropriate for integration into the Trivium Method. In other words, is NVC a good replacement for rhetoric in the Trivium? It would need to be consistent with the following statement. Rhetoric is the expression of knowledge and understanding which is consistent with reality. So if you're changing the definitions of your words, if you're avoiding confrontation, if you're not taking a solid stance on what your position is because it might be seen as aggressive, are you being consistent with reality? So regardless of any particular method of communication you're going to use, NVC or anything else, it must fit the criteria of the above statement. Knowledge and understanding, which is consistent with reality. Okay?
And now we're on 22.
On 22, okay, so what is nonviolent communication? I got a lot of the definitions off School Sucks Project. You can find it anywhere, but we're specifically talking about the people using NVC with Trivium, so I tried to grab the definitions from there. Nonviolent communication, a method of using OFNR, I'll get into that in a minute, OFNR and the 4Ds, applied internally and externally for the purpose of creating effective bridges of empathy. Okay, so with our statement, rhetoric is the expression of knowledge and understanding which is consistent with reality and bridges of empathy. Are we on the same page? So right off the bat, the sniff test is already starting to fail.
Right. So what they're basically doing is they're focused on the emotions and empathy rather than on what's reality.
Yeah, and I would even say that there's an even more nefarious assumption underneath all of it, which we'll get to at the very end.
Okay.
Okay, so it's been designed by Marshall Rosenberg, who was a student of Carl Rogers. So we'll get into the history of things. In 1972, the OFNR model was existent since at least 1992. So this is something that's been evolving and creating. So in their definition, they see empathetic lens. So I'm going to define OFNR and the 4Ds, and I'm going to focus on those areas. Quite honestly, a lot of the holdups for me doing this, outside of just being pissed off at people that use it, was that there is so many different ways that I could apply fallacies to NVC. So I've only glanced across the surface of it. And there's also a huge rabbit hole of the history behind it. It really spiders out into many things, so I could only touch on the surface of that too. So in any of this, it's really about you guys taking this, and then if you want, investigate it further for yourself.
Right, and you and I will do at least one more follow-up show to this, going into at least some of those rabbit holes and the direct connections to the Club of Rome and the CIA and MK Ultra, which Dr. Carl Rogers, who you just mentioned, was MK Ultra Project, Subproject 97.
Yeah. Okay, so 4 Ds of disconnected communication or life alienating communication. C, demands, unrequested. Diagnosis, deserve-orientated language, and denial of responsibility. Okay, so demands, the first D. Commands that are given usually with a carrot stick attached consequence. You will do this now or else. So this idea is attached to the use of imperative sentences, that any imperative sentence is really a demand. You're making demands of a person, and you should reword those imperative sentences as requests. Or in NVC speak, you may want to rephrase an imperative sentence in the form of a request. So you see how you do that? Okay. I'll go on to the next D, is diagnosis that are unrequested. Labels, adjectives, and comparisons which are used as attempts to place an individual within a generalized evaluation. These are often forms of the hasty generalization fallacy. Often, sometimes maybe they're accurate. Now, let's contrast that with a definition of diagnosis. Diagnosis is the identification of the nature and cause of a certain phenomena. So let's look at those two things. A diagnosis, labels, adjectives, comparisons, which are used as attempts to place on an individual, or the identification of the nature and cause of certain phenomena. How else are you going to come to definitions without using adjectives and comparisons and contrast? This goes back to the idea that you shouldn't judge people. It's wrong. But you need to know who you're dealing with.
Right.
Right. So we do need to assess people, and we do need to hold people to certain standards. We do need to make those judgments. Judgment is very important. Being judgmental, that's something else, but judgment is very important. So this is a blanket statement to say don't use your judgment. Okay, so I've got this. This is a conflated.
And let me just say that don't use judgment on people while they're using this hasty generalization fallacy to diagnose where someone's mental thoughts are and how to apply the rhetoric to them, rather than not focusing on the facts themselves and then presenting the facts how they are.
But it's not a diagnosis because I'm only doing it internally. Okay, this was something that came up. Only do the NVC internally. You never say it to somebody. I would never use it that way, but maybe I would do this inside my own head.
Right, and they've admitted this in conversations with you and I, et cetera, that they are doing this internal judgment, this internal ad hominem fallacy on everybody that they present this information to.
That's
or
right.
that they present any information to, because this is the, as you said, internal process that they're going through as they present information.
Yeah. So if I say to you, you know what, Ron, Jan, you're wrong. You're wrong on this point. I've made a demand, or I've made a hasty generalization of you. I've diagnosed you as wrong, and that therefore is violent. So as an NVCer, I'm dealing with a violent person. I need to make a bridge of empathy to that person. Right. And oh, by the way, it's not because I am wrong. It's because.
Right, and then what they do is they use all of this softball language to then try to approach you and work on that angle of their diagnosis, totally dismissing the facts entirely and then trying to force their own assumptions based on this diagnosis. Oh, Jan, you're an asshole. Oh, Jan, you're depressed or whatever. They'll just dream up all of this language. Never mind that you or I may be being an asshole because they keep avoiding the facts of the subject to focus on this mealy-mouthed nonsense.
Or I'm being an asshole because the ideas that you're spreading throughout the world, my daughter and her kids are going to have to live with. and I'm
Right,
passionate, and I'm going to
exactly.
come after you.
And you and I are both parents, and so when we see this kind of mealy mouth nonsense going on, and we see it all over the place within former associates of mine, etc., that who use these tactics to do this stuff.
Mm-hmm. Now here's the other thing about the NVC is, I'm sure there's people out there going, I use NVC, but I would never ignore the facts, and it's not really about that. When we get further along this, you're going to see that this mealy mouth stuff and redefining stuff has a very particular effect within the conversation, that they're using a tactic without even being aware of it. So, and that's a key point here. Okay, so we've covered that it's a conflated term which really represents critical thinking and equate it with an ad hominem, right? So if we're going to take diagnosis as the identification of phenomena, and we're going to say, well, no, that's a person, generalizing me and putting labels on me. And then the other contradiction is within NVC, there's this idea of jackal language. And I remember watching a TNH video with you, and you had started to say something, and one of the other people there just shouted out jackal language and shut down the whole conversation. How is that not a diagnosis? How is that not a hasty generalization? How is that not a label? All right. So the definition of jackal and giraffe used in NVC would be seen as an example of generalized evaluations. And these are, I wouldn't even say they're evaluations, because they're not adjectives and comparisons of the person that you find in reality. They're ones imposed based on an a priori definition of what violence is. Although it could be argued that it addresses the person's speech and not the person, the effect is the same. It invalidates the person's statement by citing their intention as violent, not based on content, but intention.
Exactly right. And so next slide, we're on 25 now.
Okay, so denial of responsibility. Abdication of an individual in being able to respond to a given situation, usually represented as a cognitive and emotional disconnection within the individual. Okay, have you ever been able to look at somebody and said there is a cognitive and emotional disconnection within that person? Is that a broad enough occurrence in reality to actually have that as a mainstream thought in your mind when you're dealing with people on the street?
Well, only if I'm avoiding the facts at hand and focusing on an ad hominem attack on the person instead to justify my mealy mouth language that I'm going to use in my approach to them.
Well, again, it's not that I am wrong in my position. It's that they are disconnected emotionally.
Right. And in fact, we saw this tactic used on me just 2 days ago on Facebook by someone in this group.
Ah, yeah. We should introduce the idea of falsifiability.
Okay.
That an assessment of something isn't a valid assessment. Like I was saying about pseudo-explanations, it isn't a valid explanation unless it can be falsified somehow. If it's impervious to falsification, it's not an explanation. You can't vet it. You can't test it. You can't draw the connection back to reality. So if I'm in a conversation with somebody and they do something that sets me off, and I say they're an emotional or cognitive disconnection, how do I falsify my assumption of that? If I'm making that assessment of them, how do I falsify that? You can't. Okay. So I'll go on with it. There are many occasions where there is an active or passive denial by an individual of the evidence that shows a cause-effect relationship between the choices of an individual and the effects of those choices. You maybe lose control, so it's your fault that I. So one of the things that you'll notice, we'll get into confusion technique and how being very wordy and kind of strange with how you're using words causes a certain amount of confusion in people, which leaves them susceptible to suggestion. And a lot of these definitions are that way.
Yeah. So over verboseness can be used,
and redundancy,
right.
And taking what would be common clauses that people use and just changing them slightly. The underlying idea here is that emotional responses one has is ultimately their choice and not caused by the other. Now, I'm all for taking emotional responsibility, but if you do something that pisses me off, my emotion is an effect of your action. So I'm not going to stand there and go, oh, well, I shouldn't have reacted that way because you punched me in the nose or you slept with my wife. I'm going to be pissed off at you because it's an appropriate reaction to your crappy behavior. So if you're being mealy-mouthed with me and manipulative and slippery, and I start getting frustrated with you, it's not that I'm not being emotionally responsible. I'm being emotionally expressive.
Based on the facts of your behavior in the first place and how you're approaching me.
Right. So this is a way of projecting irresponsibility onto the other person and say, if they're being emotional like this, I'm not dealing with an emotionally responsible person. But the underlying understanding there, the assumption behind that is that I am never responsible for somebody else's reaction. So they're standing in a place of irresponsibility, throwing it on the other person and saying if they're upset, they are somehow emotionally immature.
They're emotionally immature because they got upset because I slept with their wife, lied to their face, ripped them off, stole their money, stole their car. I mean, there's no cause and effect from my actions on them. They're just emotionally immature.
Okay. Yeah. Now a lot of people are going to say, "Oh, well, you're taking an extreme case. That's not really how it works. You know, you got a person that's very attached to an idea, and I've confronted them. They're going to get upset." My stance is it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what the other person's emotional state is. If I'm stating knowledge that I've gained through the trivium, I've got a position and I'm stating my case, their emotion is irrelevant. What's relevant is the content of what they're saying to me.
However, if you're only focused on using this mealy-mouthed rhetoric and you're avoiding the general grammar and focused on catering to, presenting to their emotional sensitivities or disconnection, then you are misusing all of this, and you should be called out for it.
Yeah. So in every step of the way here, we can draw a conclusion about the person that we're talking with, ignore their content, ignore their grammar, ignore their logic, whether it's valid or false, focus on them as a human being, their emotional state, their cognitive state that I'm assessing for myself based on this framework that I can never falsify, and then I can stand back and have a formula to now deal with them. It's sort of an empathetic stance. Talk about putting yourself in a disempowered place. That when you're in that conversation, operating from something like NVC, you're not even a person in the room. You are a formula of managing another person. You're
Well
irrelevant
said.
at that point.
Right. Well said.
And you're not communicating with somebody. You're not being empathetic with somebody. You're managing them by your framework. So
right. And you're trying to lead them to the conclusions that you want rather than basing conclusions on the general grammar itself.
Oh, well, but all I want is what's the best for them. And because they're emotionally disconnected and irresponsible and don't take emotional responsibility, I know what's best for them.
Then, yeah, ad hominem, self-appealing ad veracundium fallacy. I mean, you go right down the list there.
And if they disagree with me, then they must not be at a place where they can see what's good for them in the first place.
Right.
So where's the mitts off? Where's the respect of the individual? Where's the respect that somebody can look at the same information that you have and have a different value set and draw a different conclusion and disagree with you?
Now, we should also realize that if they are looking at the same actual general grammar and not just your appeals to emotion, etc., that a contradiction is a lie or an error, and we should be able to remove those fallacies and come to the exact same conclusion with that information in the commons.
With one exception.
With one exception, that if
I would say that if there's ever disagreements, it comes down to one of two things. It's either definitions. There's a misunderstanding, or people are using different definitions, so it's a misunderstanding. Or it's not, if they don't share the same values. So you can have a person with a different value set look at the same evidence as you, and their logic will be different based on that value set.
However, if the person is rational and reasonable, you should be able to look into that value set and then understand that contradiction.
Yeah, but it's not always a contradiction. So I've seen this happen where you can have people with different value sets. They're both valid. They just have different priorities around life. And at that point, when you're in that point, you agree to disagree and go, you know what, I do get where you're coming from. And I do get that because you're 20 years old and want to party, and I'm a father and worry about my kids. We have different values. And walk away from that. And it's important because the marketplace of ideas is terribly important for society, for individuals, is to allow people to have their own views. It's not for me to manipulate you into my views. It's not for me to convince you to think like I do. It's for me to have a position, be able to back it up, and be able to express it. So anything that we do, we have application, we have understanding, and we have commitment. And on any of those levels, you can attack somebody's argument. Your understanding's off. You can't speak worth crap. I can't understand what you're saying. Or you're not committed to your idea. You're just ad hoc, wishy-washy. But if somebody has those three things, you can walk away from each other without there being bad blood and just say, we look at it differently, and I get where you're coming from, and that's, pretty cool, but I disagree. And that's fine. This is about taking your value set and manipulating somebody else into adopting it.
You're talking about with NVC, right?
Yeah. Okay. So I've got one last paragraph here about the denial of responsibility. It ignores the possibility that people can have emotional impacts on others. In the definition itself, it has a diagnosis with qualified language. So you notice that the language is never a firm stance. It's always a maybe or kinda or sometimes. A diagnosis with qualified language regarding the other person's inner state as cognitive emotional disconnection. It affords a convenient stance for the NVCer to regard a passionate argument as emotional disconnection. Intention, not content, is the focus. So we're focusing on intention again. All right, let's fly through deserve-oriented language. Similar refusal or abdication as with denial of responsibility of an individual being able to respond to a given situation, usually represented as a cognitive and emotional disconnection within the individual. So again, we're back to a cognitive or emotional so you're just qualifying the person emotionally and cognitively at this point. Punishments and rewards are often referred to while using deserve-oriented language. You, I deserve to, you, I don't deserve. Again, the definition contains a diagnosis of the other person's inner state. So the importance of this being a diagnosis of their inner state, it's a state that you can't verify. Well, you can. The only way you can verify is to ask them, is that what you're feeling? And be able to trust their answer. You can't just make up that diagnosis, find a bunch of reasons to verify it, and say that you know it. There's no reality towards your assessment. So if a person's emotional response is becoming relevant to the topic at hand, if you want to know the diagnosis, ask them. You seem really upset about it. I don't get it. Why are you so pissed off? I'm just saying I like red Corvettes over blue. And then the person can tell you, and then you can come to different definitions and move the conversation along. Just ask. So it's a very arrogant stance. It reminds me of spirituality, where you take this moral high ground, like you're more spiritually advanced or emotionally mature or more cognitively developed, and then you take this condescending approach to everybody that you're dealing with. So again, the definition contains a diagnostic component regarding the person's inner state. This idea is linked to either or if-then propositions, which would be better worded as and also. So what are we doing here? What are one of the premises behind existence exists, or the law of identity? Law of identity is it's either is or it is not. It's either or. It's not is kinda and is not somehow.
She's kind of pregnant.
Yeah, really. Okay, and then it converts them to and also statements. This is a direct attack against the law of identity in your own speech. If I don't use if then, or what is it, either or, I'm also not taking a very definitive stance on what my position is. If I say and also, maybe kinda, what I'm doing is I'm dissolving or obfuscating my position, which leaves a person in an uncertain ground. Who am I talking to? Where are they coming from? They can't assess that. So this is really about stepping away from solid definitions. It's moving out of the definitions. It's getting wishy-washy. So this idea undermines the language of cause and effects. Changing propositions this way changes the meaning of your statements without changing the content. And that affords you two things. It allows you to change the definition mainstream if somebody responds to your argument, or it allows you to back out of the position if you realize you can't win. Slippery definitions like patriarchy do that. They shift the definition anytime somebody comes up with evidence against it. So this is about making slippery definitions. So how can you value the trivium and then start mucking around with definitions, the meaning of your statements? Okay. I'm going to move on.
What are we on, 27 now?
Yeah, we're going to move on to 27. Okay, this is OFNR, observations, feelings, needs, and requests. It's this area that I think a lot of people that are interested in the trivium are attracted to NVC. Not only that it helps win arguments, but it seems to line up with grammar, logic, rhetoric. So it's a procedure. You're supposed to begin with observations without making any assessment of them. Identify your feelings, state your needs, or identify your needs and make requests, and so on. If we look at this picture, there's some meta messages behind this picture. If you look at the inputs, we've got two inputs. I'm going to have to blow this up so I can see it here. If we look at, there's two inputs. External objects go into observation. Then we have need strategies, and we have the cognitive mind. The cognitive mind is defined as perceptions colored by, what is it? I can't read it. Age, thought, visualization, judgment, view, and opinion. So cognitive mind is colored by thinking, judgment, view, opinion.
And notice the loaded language there, colored by.
Exactly. And needs and strategies are at the top, because one of the premises behind nonviolent communication is needs are never in conflict, only strategies to fulfill needs are. But it's up top there, and you can see there's no connection from observation to anything else. That's a meta message. Now we have another input at the bottom. Get this. We have breath, which moves into feelings, and we have spirit, which moves into feelings in the body.
So we have to appeal to emotions, which negates number one, which was observation.
Well, what's spirit? How are they defining spirit? What does breath have to do with it?
Spirit,
are we talking about
do you mean Scotch spirits or?
Yeah, exactly. So again, we've got inserted in here. We're starting to get into where the misintegration comes in.
And so what we see here is they're using potentially fallacies of equivocation, because, you know, what is spirit? What does that mean? Breath, okay. Breath.
And how is that related?
And how is it really? Yeah, I mean, what is it? It's a nothing. It's, you know, under the trivium, under relevance presumption, fallacies of relevance, presumption, or ambiguity, it would fall under relevance. And right. Ambiguity, for that matter.
Yeah, and ambiguity is a big part of this. And if you look at the bottom of the F circle there, feelings and emotions, so we go from observations to feelings, and there's no connection between the two. We have at the bottom, happy and satisfied, and then that moves into an affect, honesty, desire to connect, empathy, sincere intention, compassion, and so on. You guys can read the slide. Which then leads into a skillful request. Okay, so the output of this is to make a skillful request.
Wait,
if I'm feeling happy and satisfied.
let me just point out something right here, because that number one, the O, goes to itself. So you have an observation, and then you go, and I'm going to put that over here in the back of my mind because it goes nowhere. And then you're going to focus on breath and spirit to come up with a skillful request.
That's right. Now, if you're feeling anger, fear, or sadness, again, none of this is based on your observation or knowledge.
Because observation is totally separate from any of the rest of the diagram.
Yeah, that's right. Then we move into shame and no choice, attachment, strategy of outcome, desire to control, and so on, which then leads into violence, tragic expressions of unmet needs and demands. Okay?
You know, this diagram here just makes it so blatantly obvious that nonviolent communication is complete garbage.
Yeah. And I'm sure some will say, well, I don't agree with this, or that's not really how it works. It's much more nuanced. At the end of the day, what's driving the effect are two things. Your emotions. It's either going to drive you to anger and control, or it's going to take you down into respect and empathy. It's one. So the feelings are driving your actions. So if you watch the meditation video, how do we define emotion? But when we were confronted with a conflict of information that conflicted with the definition of self or world, when new information came in that you needed to assimilate, that you're resisting, it's negative. If you're assimilating, it's positive, right?
Right.
That emotion is not information in and of itself. Emotion is just your reaction to information. So how has NVC got anything to do with choice when the legs that you're standing on is that everything that you're going to do is going to be based on your reaction to information? Whether it's positive reaction or negative reaction, it's still an emotional reaction. It's treating emotion as though it's information in the world. Not information about you, but information about what's going on in the world.
Right.
It also ends in either demands or requests. And there's an underlying assumption here that your needs are met through other people. It's not action. It's not skillful action. Skillful action, skillful requests, skillful collaboration. It's skillful requests, period. Where is it in here, skillful instruction? It's only demands and requests. So there's an underlying premise here that takes us away from the idea of independence and over into a thing called interdependence. Okay? So I will move on to the next slide, 28, which defines these things now. Observations without evaluation. And then note, previous image states perceptions, colored by ego, thoughts, judgment, views, and opinions. So perceptions are colored. And then the next one is feelings. Note, no mention that emotion may color observations, which you pointed out.
That's a pretty blatant omission there too, you know.
Yeah, because most would say that emotions color perception.
Right, not the other way around.
Yeah. Needs, motivating factors. Are all motivating factors based on needs? Are interpreting or expressing needs relevant to all topics? Is the outcome of my communication always going to be a statement of needs and fulfilling needs? So this is another core assumption behind nonviolent communication, is that all human actions are a strategy to fulfill a need. And now you mix that with the idea that all needs are met through other people. What have you done? You've just disempowered the person. I have to rely on others to have my needs met, and everything I do has an underlying need. So I'm needy and I'm powerless.
Right.
Requests, actions. Is a request of action always required, which we've gone on to. So what's the underlying assumption? Needs are met through other people and interdependence. And interdependence is a key one that we'll get into with the history of things. It ties into Bateson and cybernetics. Okay, so on slide 29, I've lined up where I think people look at this and see some alignment with the trivium, where they see observations and feelings as sort of data collection about yourself, and that lines up to grammar. That my needs or my motivating factors is really my logic or my dialectic. And then the request is my output of sort of self-awareness. Now, I think trivium can be applied in terms of self-awareness, without a doubt. I don't think this would be the application of it. Like you can use the trivium, what are the what's of an emotional state that I'm having, or even the thoughts and stuff I'm happening, which can develop nuanced understanding of, when there's tension in my chest here, or, when my jaw clenches, it becomes precursors to certain filters on my thinking and so on. It can be used internally. I'm not saying that that's not the case. What I'm saying is that NVC is not a replacement for the trivium applied internally. It's a corruption of it. So is observations and feelings really the data that you're dealing with? If I identify my feelings as being, well, I'm feeling vulnerable, is that really data? Or is that a reaction to the world? And if I want to look at my reaction to my world, it would, with the trivium, it would be something more along the lines like so I'm feeling vulnerable. What is the data of that in my body? What's the proprioceptive sensation? How is that affecting the envelope of awareness? Like you can go into that, but you can't stop at feelings being the data of grammar, right? So if you want to use the trivium as sort of an internal pursuit, it's about identifying things. And as you do that, identifying things internally within your own awareness, if you want to do that, it's moving into more nuanced effects of those sensations in that awareness. It's not stopping at the top, it's digging down. How does needs line up with logic? Well, in NVC, all of your logic is built on the foundation of needs. So anything that you're thinking, how you're understanding something, is based on one a priori definition. What I'm thinking is a need. What I'm doing is fulfilling a need. So even me doing this presentation with you, Jan, I'm fulfilling a need deep in my soul. And what is it? To be validated or something else like that, right? They can't be
rather than just pointing out the facts of the matter and to come to truth. It's got to be needs. You've got some psychological issue that you need fulfilled from others outside you.
That's right. And that's what motivates all our action, as opposed to, say, identifying something that needs to be done and then doing it.
Exactly.
The house is on fire, we have to put it out. Well, you have a need to keep the house from burning down the neighborhood. Well, sure, but you know what? What's motivating me right now is that the action needs to be taken. Somebody needs to say something about NVC. You know what I mean? I don't want to sell a book or have more interviews or anything. I don't have a need to have people agree with me. There's something that needs to be done here, so let's do it, right? We have access to do that, let's do that, right? Okay. So again, it's that whole neediness behind it. Then requests and actions. Within the trivium, you simply state your position. If you've used the trivium, your grammar, logic, and rhetoric lines up, you simply communicate your understanding. You communicate how that ties back into reality. You simply state your position. And if you've done it well, and if you've done the trivium well, any emotion you have around it starts to come down a notch, because the knowledge replaces the emotion. You don't have to use emotion to win your argument because you have the information.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
Right. Okay. If you have an action that needs to be requested, you just make the request. This isn't a lifestyle. It is context specific. So you can't take something that's context specific and then apply it as a generalization, which is what's going on here. Okay. So I'm on 30. This is the internal application of trivium. This is just my opinion. People can do this for themselves and figure out their own stuff. But grammar, be aware of your own inner activity, somatic sensations, feelings, emotions, be able to identify and clarify those occurrences. Find the causal relationships. What does it feel like? Build some awareness around it by paying attention to it. Logic. Be able to understand those emotions, be able to see the causal relationships, how it rises, how it settles, how it affects thinking. Look at your epistemology. What are the relationships? Why does it work this way? The rhetoric. Be able to articulate it, which NVC, I think a lot of people find value in NVC because they can articulate their needs and their needs get met and they can do things like that. So there is an application here, but the Trivium already addresses it. Be able to function with these emotions and these motivators while they're at play with you without them cluttering your thinking. And you can only do that through being aware of it, working it. So you can say, I'm getting pissed off right now, but I'm going to keep my head cool. And I know how to do that because I know where to relax in my body because I'm aware of its in the somatic sensations and so on. And then I'm going to speak from my knowledge rather than my emotions. And if you drive me to a line, then I'll speak from my emotions and you'll know you pushed me too far. When it becomes appropriate. So you don't need NVC to have this spiritual awakening that people are talking about. What you need is awareness, epistemology, commitment. Thinking, understanding, seeing, and commitment to do it. That's what we need. Okay, does that make sense?
Perfectly clear to me, and it has been for a long time.
So the next thing that they go into is a thing called language of obligation, and there's some examples of it here. We use the use of words to imply or explicitly state a message using the 4 Ds of disconnection: demands, diagnosis, deserve-oriented language, and denial of responsibility, towards oneself or towards another individual, for the known or unknown purpose of creating extrinsic or externally motivated events or actions, such as threats of punishment or promises of rewards, which result in strategies often creating perceived winners and losers. Examples of language of obligation: should, must, need to, ought to, right, moral, wrong, immoral, extrinsically created rights, either or, debate, scarcity perspective, win-lose or lose-lose engineering, extrinsic motivations, punishment rewards, received given, coercive situations. Now, if we think this through, take a look, for instance, where it says extrinsically created rights. Well, what is the function of a right if it's not external to myself? If I have an internal right that's internal to me, an extrinsically created right is a very important thing in an open and free society, is it not?
It absolutely is. And you know what? Let me interject here for a moment, Bill. When we think of NVC, it takes away rights and wrongs and then focuses the attention as your own fault rather than focusing on the actions and behaviors of the person. It kind of nullifies everything outside of the trivium, where you can see someone is clearly lying or intentionally manipulating information, and it focuses everything back onto the emotions and sort of like a quantum physics mishmash, right? Where anything is possible, nothing really matters. It's like do without wilt with the Crowleyan stuff.
Right, and so right off the bat, how do we distinguish the difference between right and wrong? We find that in the world, don't we?
Right, and it's if I'm taking information and I take it and twist it and intentionally lie to you, then I've misrepresented it. I've passed down a mental virus. Right.
That's right. Yeah. So I mean, and you can go through the whole list here. So right and wrong. So NVCers will never say, well, I would never tell somebody not to use the language of obligation, but there's an implied context behind the language of obligation. We shouldn't, which is right off the top of the list, should, shouldn't, must, need to. We shouldn't use the language of obligation. That's violence. But right in there is the idea of right or wrong or morality and immorality. So should we avoid those topics? Those are important topics. Either or debate is the same thing. If we're talking about the selection or a choice, we're talking about either or. They cite here scarcity perspective, win, lose, lose, lose. But what about win-win? It's the implication that NVC is win-win. But a win-win situation is a situation where both people are offering their consent.
Correct. And not one person manipulating the other person into a false consent based on avoiding the grammar and then manipulating the emotions of that person to then achieve a so-called win-win position. And then the person may walk away and in hindsight look back and say, wait, I was manipulated. You know, this none of this is based on any of the facts.
No, not at all. The entire thing is a disregard for the facts. It's this idea of democratic truth or democratic knowledge, where everybody's view, regardless of the foundation of it, regardless of the motivation behind it, regardless of the logical outcomes of it, should be weighed equally. So at the end of the day, the common ground that we all share, whether we agree with it or not, is that reality is real and that there are real consequences to our actions. So a democratic truth, right off that one foundation, that one axiom that existence exists and there are real consequences to our actions, goes out the window. This is not about engineering win-lose situations. We can have win-win situations that are based in reality, but reality is found in fact. It is found in the grasp of fact after we've gone through a rigorous period of logic and epistemology. At every step of the way, NVC is taking a context-specific concept that when people have emotional debates where somebody might get upset, how do you iron out that emotional interference? So while we have to find a common ground, we can be nice to each other, we can be respectful, and then maybe we can get back to communicating. It takes this very context-specific idea and then applies it like it's a principle in reality, that it applies to every situation.
That it's an axiom.
That and they are presenting it as an axiom down here. Essentially, it's a generalization. It's a principle that's then being applied to every situation. And what gets lost there is reality.
Right.
The reality of the context that we're operating within. They say here, they're talking about the language of obligation being the engineering of coercive situations. And every step of my investigation in NVC is about creating coercive situations. And we'll get into that more in part 2, where we really break down the mechanism of it and then the history of where that mechanism was created. For the time being, I think we should probably go on to the next slide. We're going on to
the language of choice.
The language of choice. The use of words to describe or make understandable to oneself or others an enhanced perspective of abundant possibilities, choices, and internal-external evidence of respect and understanding. The Trivium Method of critical thinking used in conjunction with NVC allows for this language to both be understood and spoken. Examples of the language of choice: prefer to, shall to, choose to, decide to, individually preferable, less preferable, intrinsically generated respect of individual choice, as opposed to extrinsically generated respect that is created from fear or punishment or desire for rewards. Internal, external, cause, effect, known and used for decision-making processes. So let's go up to the top. Choices and internal, external evidence of respect and understanding. So Jan, if you're looking for evidence of respect and understanding, where would you find objective evidence of that?
Somebody who was willing to tell the truth about something and not water something down to cater to some false emotional state. I mean, to me, that would be highly disrespectful because they're not willing to even deal with the truth and tell me that truth in the beginning, in the first place.
And one way of trying to vet the internal evidence of somebody else is to simply ask them.
Sure.
We don't need a
good point, huh?
It's just ask and get more information.
Sure.
The information we get for our decisions comes from the world. And it doesn't come in our interpretation.
Sorry, and NVC is always focusing on creating a judgment, a percept of the person who is the target to manipulate, rather than asking them, and then forcing your opinions or your rhetoric to cater to that percept that you've made about that person in the first place without actually asking them.
But you know what else? Don't ever reveal it. So, I mean,
Exactly.
Rosenberg and those folks, when we get into the history of it, Rosenberg and the mainstream people that are pushing NVC, they never take it outside of relationships or conflict resolution and so on. But the people that are bringing this into the trivium, they're taking it beyond a context that's appropriate. They're taking beyond a context that's about emotion and about respect and so on. And they're taking it into a broad spectrum. They're making it a precept, right? And this is taking. So if there's any argument saying, well, the history is terrible, but you know what, I'm going to change it and make it worthwhile, that goes out the window, because what they've done is they've changed it and they've made it worse.
Exactly correct. I would 100% agree with that.
Okay. So I think by the end of both of these, this presentation and the next part, that'll become very obvious. Critical thinking used in conjunction with NVC allows for this language both to be understood and spoken. I would assert the Trivium Method, done properly, alone allows us to be understood and to be able to speak it. NVC does just the opposite. It caters to ambiguity. It by conflating these terms and turning their definitions slightly into something that's marginalized, is not about creating understanding and creating communication. It's the opposite.
And if anybody picks up on what is being done to them as well, it would completely negate any apology or any understanding that's been reached, because then you're offended by this manipulative, mealy-mouthed language that never really came to a true conclusion or made a real bridge, because it's all based on falsehood.
Well, and then this advice to only use it internally, in other words, don't speak what you're thinking in your head. I'm going to assess you, Jan. I'm going to assess your internal state, your intentions. I'm going to match up your words to a predefined list, and then come up with a diagnosis that you're either cognitively or emotionally disconnected.
Oh, I'm depressed.
Yeah, and then I'm never gonna go through a process to try to vet and clarify whether that conclusion is based in reality or not. I'm going to keep it to myself.
Right.
So how does that fall in line with the Trivium at all? Okay.
It doesn't at all.
I could go on for too long on this. I'm going to go to the next slide, which is just a list. It just lines up the language of obligation against the language of choice, which I would pose is a false dichotomy. If I say you should do this versus you might prefer to do this, it's because you should do this because the car might fall and crush your chest versus you might prefer strawberry over chocolate. It's because, in one situation, preference is relevant. In another situation, imperative commands are relevant. So we have should versus prefer to, need to must versus shall or choose to, ought to versus decide to, right, moral, wrong, immoral versus individually preferable or less preferable. Can I ask you, Jan, is it less preferable to kill your neighbor? Extrinsically created rights, intrinsically generated respective individual choice. Any internal right that I have there is no need for an internal right in terms of the world. Extrinsically created rights is what allows us to have a free and open society. Either or debate. Extrinsically created rights, either or debate, scarcity perspective, win-lose or lose-lose. Extrinsic motivations, punishment, rewards, received, given, coercive situations versus external, internal, cause and effect, known and used for decision-making processes. So any any step down this list, when you line them up, you have to ask yourself, what am I gaining and what am I losing? And in any step that you go through there, what you're ignoring or what you're losing is verification in reality. And what you're gaining is a focus on emotion or intention. So do we weigh emotion and intention equally to actual behavior with consequences in the world?
No, of course not.
So, okay, so let's just go on to the next slide. Equivocation, the fallacy of equivocation. It's a noun. The use of ambiguous language to conceal the truth or avoid committing oneself. Prevarication. It's essentially softening one's position through modified prepositional language. Okay, so not the content, the subjects and the predicates, but the prepositional language in an effort to control the reaction of other people. Okay? So there's one theme throughout all of this. There is the reaction of other people, make a bridge of empathy to another person so that you can communicate. So there's this constant focus on what the other person's reaction is. But there's also all of these rules of thumb to soften one's position through modified prepositional language.
Give an example of an equivocation.
What's an example? Well, what is an example of an equivocation? I can't think of one at the moment.
It's essentially when a word has, if it's a single word, that word has more than one definition or understanding.
Yeah, and so this goes back to the definitions being slightly skewed. It allows for the equivocation. There's a word here that should be in the definition that isn't, and that's obfuscation.
Obfuscation.
Yes, and it's making your language intentionally obscure or ambiguous. So I have an instinct for this because for many years under spiritual teachers, meditation gurus, this is exactly how they speak all the time. It's always equivocation. It's always slippery definitions. It's always obscure and ambiguous language.
You can see that throughout the 60s, and the New Age literature as well. It's everywhere.
Yeah, and if you look at most religious texts, even Eastern texts and so on, there is always that opening to back away from the content of what you're saying based on a very loose commitment implied by the prepositional language, the context of what you're saying, background, foreground. So if I say, Jan, you may want to do this, and you say, no effing way I'm going to do that, I'm going to say, well, listen, I'm just saying it's a choice, and I can back off, and I can rein back my commitment to that stance. Well, if you're constantly speaking from a place with that lack of commitment, and somebody's trying to communicate with you, that means that they always have to step forward and try to recreate your state of mind to understand where you're coming from. How am I going to communicate with you if I don't have definitions? So if I have these soft definitions, I'm constantly reaching and for those definitions. And this happens with the term patriarchy all the time, is that patriarchy is such a slippery term that if you approach it with evidence, then they change the definition. And then you approach that with evidence and they change the definition again. So, anyways, equivocation. I just want to say one thing. When we first started looking at this, I pulled equivocation as one fallacy to look at. I think when you and I were on Skype, at that point I had a list of about 24 or 26 fallacies that you could take any one of these definitions and apply to. So for those out there, you can do your own homework with that.
And on the Trivium website, I should mention that there are a whole logic studies and things up there that we recommend people study all of them, and they'll understand all of this stuff just fine. Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to move on to the next slide. And this is the gist of NVC. So this is the best definition that I could find that summed up all of NVC. It's a bridge of empathy, a metaphor for a connection of mutual knowledge and understanding of the feelings and needs, motivating factors, of all communicating individuals, subjectively measured by virtue of apparent signs of caring and respect. Okay? So we're going to take this statement as what NVC is, the best description or definition of NVC. And I'm going to move on to the next slide. And this is really coming to the point of this first presentation. Initially, we went through the trivium, and from that, we tried to derive what would be a statement of value that defines the trivium. And then specifically around the rhetoric phase of the trivium. And we came to this: the expression of knowledge and understanding which is consistent with reality. So let's measure that statement. That's our standard of measure to see if NVC fits with the trivium. And we're going to measure NVC against this statement. Creating connections of mutual knowledge and understanding of the feelings and needs and motivating factors of all communicating individuals, subjectively measured by virtue of apparent signs of caring and respect. Now, subjectively versus objectively, does that fit with the trivium? Apparent signs, because a sign is apparent until we verify. So how does that fit with an understanding which is consistent with reality?
It doesn't at all.
It doesn't. So how accurate are the terms in NVC? When we look at the language of obligation or the 4Ds, are they providing clarity or are they creating ambiguity?
Ambiguity.
And does ambiguity fit with a consistence with reality?
Not at all.
How does NVC set subjectively measurable by apparent signs for consistency with reality? Where does it vet and self-correct against reality? There's no mechanism in NVC that self-corrects to make sure it's consistent with reality. By the previous definition, how does NVC ensure consistency with reality? Some would say this is where the trivium comes in. The trivium provides this. The trivium will make sure that you're consistent with reality, and NVC will allow you to bridge this gap with the other person. However, NVC relies on equivocation of entire subsets of language, deeming it violent, demanding, or obligatory by definition, and uses unfalsifiable, unverified, keep it internal, emotional assessments, which are to be kept to yourself. I would never suggest somebody say that to the other person. I would never suggest you say the ad hominem to the person. I think you should just keep it to yourself in assessing what they're saying, right? So at first glance, it's obvious that NVC is anti-trivium, all right? So this, all we've done right now is a smell test of NVC to see even if this is something worthwhile looking at. And at a cursory glance, it's very obvious that NVC has a value set underneath it that is the exact opposite of what the Trivium method is about.